Thanks, Yonson. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here today to partake in this wonderful conference. And it seems like such a great time to actually be discussing some of these issues, given just how the coronavirus has revealed to us some of the issues and problems we have in our digital systems and our understandings of them. So thanks to the translators and Yonson and the organisation team, and also Gyeongjin University as well. So my talk today is really a critical reflection on 3 research projects that I've conducted over the last 3 years. And I've worked with collaborators, particularly Neil Selwyn at Monash University. Now, while I cover some of the findings from our projects, the point of my presentation today is really to think about what worked when we were doing these education programs and what didn't work, in order to progress our understanding about how to support young people's privacy online. And indeed, there are an enormous array of implications when children's privacy is breached. So we have profiling issues, tracking, predictive analytics, to name a few, and these can have a range of long-term and short-term effects. So just as a bit of background, public concerns are acute when it comes to the issue of datification. And datification is essentially the conversion of many types or aspects of our social interactions into data that can be commodified and then used in the digital economy. So the proliferation of digital devices, platforms, and AI, combined with surveillance cameras in urban environments, facial recognition technologies in schools, airports, and the plethora of digital systems used throughout daily life mean there are literally masses of data collected about individuals, with many of us having little understanding about how our data is collected, stored, and processed. So when we consider the way that data can be used to shape individuals' behaviours, in many respects, datification presents one of the kind of big challenges of our time, as it does pose a threat to the constitution of the liberal democratic subject. However, when it comes to young people in particular, many of these issues are intensified, as the implications can have a profound impact on their social and educational futures. Like adults, young people have no way of knowing these identities that are created for them. So what we might call data doubles or data shadows. It is increasingly falling to educators to support young people to develop these kinds of understandings. So the Children's Commissioner for England recently said that it's up to schools to teach young people about how to manage their data and digital privacy. And we've had similar calls in Australia. So my talk today then is how schools might be able to support the development of children's data privacy. And when it comes to digital literacies, I really believe in developing a comprehensive education of the digital infrastructure in a way that was similar to what Professor Shin was referring to before, is that I think that is essential for a critical understanding of the digital context. Now, the approach that we took aligns with what Emajulu and McGregor call a radical digital citizenship, which seeks to problematize dominant ideas about technologies and rethink citizens' relationship with technology. So we also believe that classroom-based criticality is certainly best approached through a personal lens. So what might a critical curriculum based around personal data and privacy look like? And we tried to break it down into 6 main steps and then develop the program around this. So we start with the idea that young people need some sense of what datification involves. So starting with the idea that personal data can be considered anything from a post to a photo or geolocational information. The second thing is to critically reflect upon the importance of metrics in social media. Now, we know numerization has been around for a long time, but undoubtedly digital technology has really increased what can be numerized and how this information can then be circulated. The third thing we wanted to do is develop awareness and understanding of the political economy of digital platforms. And of course, how this is then connected to the generation and collection of personal data. So essentially to see personal data as part of a bigger kind of issue and context. Now, we know that raising awareness and critical understandings is really only part of the equation. We also need to provide all users really with strategies and tactics to manage their data. Without this sense of ability to kind of do something about this newfound information, users can end up, or individuals can end up, feeling quite anxious, ambivalent, or apathetic. So we need to provide some alternatives to them. Finally, users really need to gain a sense of the short and long-term implications of datafication. So not just now or even in the next month, but potentially for potentially spicy pieces of information, these can have implications that last 10 or 20 years. So giving young people or students a sense of those implications is a really important part of this sort of critical education. So the background, there were 3 projects involved in this kind of our exploration. And the first was what we call Data Smart 1, which we worked with teenagers 13 to 17 years. 27 participants were involved, and we developed an app called PDQ. But Data Smart 2 and 3 will kind of use the same app, which we call FriendSend, and involved a slightly younger cohort of students. So in the Data Smart 2, we worked with 44 participants aged 10 to 12 years. And then Data Smart 3, we were slightly younger again, so aged 8 to 10 years. And that was a slightly larger cohort, 125 participants. So we really relied on 2 main methods. The first of this was what we call code-based experimentation with digital media and data generation. And that was really about using chat apps in order to kind of work with young people as part of their world and then develop that critical understanding. So Data Smart 1 used a chat app called PDQ, and Data Smart 2 and 3 used FriendSend, and this was designed in collaboration with some of the students at one of the primary schools we worked at. So they came up with the name, the design, and they also came up with a little icon of the hands. Now, both chat apps were designed so that users could send texts, image, and they could also create groups. But in order to support a critical reflection, the apps were able to aggregate personal data and then reveal to each participant through the use of Google Cloud APIs how their text, image, and geolocational data could be recirculated and reused by third parties. So accompanying the apps was a web app that then was able to show how this data could be processed. All 3 projects involved a series of workshops. So we didn't want to just drop the app into the school and then let the kids and the teachers work it out for themselves. So we developed a series of workshops that built understanding alongside using the app, and then also worked with students to come up with strategies and tactics that could help them protect and manage their data in better ways. So that was the kind of goal of this educational program, but I now really want to talk about the realities of doing this work. And although this might sound kind of relatively straightforward on the surface, what we found is that actually doing this kind of code-based experimentation in schools is actually quite difficult. So the first thing that we noticed is that materializing personal data so that young people could actually see what we're talking about was a really important part of the educational process. So the main function of the app was really to kind of reveal this back-end process, the thing that is behind the infrastructure. And the website was able to process that personal data to give the students a sense of what was entailed with personal data profiling and tracking. So this is a screenshot of the dashboard, and the web app was able to process text, image and geolocational data. So this is a screenshot of my locational data, and you can probably work out from the red dots where I live. So we could talk to the students once we had this kind of information on the dashboard about where, you know, even though you might not put your address into a website, if your geolocational settings are on, many companies can work out where you live and perhaps even where you go to school. One unanticipated aspect of the project was this tension between the collective ethos of the classroom and the kind of implicit networked individualism of social media. So, which was, I guess, present also in Friendsend and is of course present in many of the mainstream social media platforms as well. Now, while social media creates collectives and networks for communication and participation purposes, it is typically negotiated by the individual alone. So for the younger participants, there was clearly benefit in initiating what was for many their first experiences of social media. So they had the guidance of their teachers and their peers, and this brought a really nice sense of collectivity to social media use and provided a safe space for these participants to kind of develop their social media practices. Now, these data processing tools are not intended to be used in a kind of a small scale way and clearly have more meaning when scaled up to millions of users. Nevertheless, all three projects were able to use artificial intelligence that was born of a group and tailor it to the individual. And this was a really interesting aspect of the project for many of the students. Now, this is my son, and I do have his consent to use this photo, but what we were able to do was show them just how if they send a particular image via the app, how this image might be read or processed using the Google APIs. So, for example, we could talk to them about one of the things that the app was able to pick up was sentiment analysis. So what is the app looking for, or what's the technology looking for when it sees you smiling? So the corners of your mouth turned up might indicate joy. So we were able to have lots of really interesting kind of critical conversations with the students around this, and in a sense, that enabled the participants to kind of think like a machine, to find these different points on the image that were triggering particular readings. For example, how it might have picked up that my son was eating when he's at the dining table. He's clearly not eating, but because his hand is up toward his mouth, that is what is kind of picked up. One additional dimension that we were interested in exploring in this project is what might be termed people's data imaginations. And in the basic sense, the term imagination is used here to refer to students' capacity to move beyond what they already know and to see things from others' point of view, and to extend their experience and thoughts in ways that might result in new insights, ideas, and aspirations. So we're really interested in getting them to think differently about data, but we actually found that this was really quite challenging. And I think, as Professor Shin's work shows, you almost need an entire project really to kind of develop how we can do data or how we can do technology differently, because it becomes so quickly ingrained in our everyday practices. What we found was that, in particular, that the young people were caught between two competing discourses, and the cyber safety discourse, which is particularly strong in Australia, and many of the students, even by 8 to 10 years old, had been bombarded with the kind of sort of cyber safety message. But they were caught between the cyber safety discourse and what Anna Hintz and colleagues call this actively manufactured general standards and design of digital platforms, which had positioned them as users and consumers within the digital economy. And this made it very difficult for them to think and act differently when it came to personal data. So often when we would try to challenge the students to kind of come up with different ways of doing data, they often reverted back to kind of the cyber safety internet awareness sort of discourse. Now, even though it was designed as an educational chat app, FriendSend was perceived by all the participants to work as a commercial chat app. And many of the younger participants in the Data Smart 2 and 3 projects had never used a chat app before, and they were very excited about it. So it was quite difficult to move them on into these more kind of critical understandings. And this could be contrasted with our Data Smart 1, where the users were already quite using social media quite frequently. And in some senses, it was easier to develop that more critical understanding because it wasn't as exciting. So you can see on the around FriendSend, we had lots of hellos, highs, and emojis just being shared. Now, the final phase of the project was to explore possibilities for alternative practices and actions. Now, all groups was essentially interested in developing practices for greater privacy, but in reality, this proved a lot more difficult to establish kind of ideas that could be carried on in their everyday life. Indeed, the initial design work groups around this theme struggled to move beyond really exaggerated kind of forms of counter practice. So often what was mentioned was, oh, we will just stop using social media altogether, which is of course not what our intention was at all. So just to summarise, what we found the challenge, we came up with there's a whole range of challenges really to doing this work in schools. The first is the tension between critical education and cyber safety. And in many ways, these two different discourses are contrary. And this was reflected across all three of our projects, with students of different ages demonstrating a strong tendency to interpret issues associated with datification through the lens of risk and danger, with explanations and solutions involving self-responsibilisation. This often made it very difficult to develop more nuanced understandings of datification, as well as tactical responses to counter data processing. Second is whether there is motivation for schools and teachers to care about one more thing as part of an already kind of quite crowded curriculum. We worked with motivated teachers who certainly had concern around profiling and privacy, but not all teachers feel the same way. So how can we encourage schools and teachers to see the importance of this issue? Third is the technological challenges of working in schools. So not only are schools often digitally compromised in one way or another, we frequently had to, internet was down or laptops weren't charged, and those kind of practical challenges really did make things difficult at times. Fourth is the ethics of using social media as part of this program. Now, while we're encouraging students to critique the data economy, and our approach was essentially implicated them in the data economy in ways that most previously had not been. So as small-scale intervention, we had little opportunity to, opportunity to not use anything other than the commercially owned platforms such as Google APIs. So the developers assured us that our participants' data would not be used for other purposes. However, it's very difficult to guarantee that. Finally, while the projects had great success in raising awareness of data processing, we are well aware that changing these practices in the future is another matter entirely. So whether or not these kinds of practices are able to be translated into young people's everyday lives is not something that we can really comment on, but that is a kind of a challenge for the future. Thank you. That's all I've got to say. Thank you.